we've arrived at questions and reflections. Let's start things off with Romanticism. What does Alberto tell Sophie was the absolute literary ideal of the Romantics? What made it the ideal for writers of this time period? And we talked about in the in-depth look that absolute ideal took the form of fairy tales for many of these romanticists, but let's find that specific reference in the book. If we look on page 353, go about 2/3 of the way down, we'll see that Alberto says the fairy tale was the absolute literary ideal of the Romantics, in the same way that the absolute art form of the Baroque period was the theater. It gave the poet full scope to explore his own creativity. And Sophie makes the comment, he could play God to a fictional universe. Now, obviously, we can see every time we see God now, we can't not play on that theme of the parallel. But now we have to wonder, is Albert a god or not? Perhaps. We'll get to that in a little bit. But still, playing God seems to be a major theme in itself for this novel. That Alberto is relating this philosophy about occasionally about God, but then Albert Nag is himself the one who's actually writing it, and he's going to use these characters and such in this particular way in order to flesh out the story and then put surprise in there. Playing God is through fiction is just an important element of the story, and already we're getting glimpses of romantic irony here. But let's talk about that with this next question. What does Alberto reveal to Sophie and ultimately Hilda to be possible about the nature of Hilda and her father's reality? And how does this suggestion resemble a romantic irony? Now, we're going to skip around a little bit here and there. So go to page 357. Between 357 and 358, we'll have bits and pieces of this available to us. So Alberto says to Sophie, he, of course, Albert Nag, he'd better watch out, Sophie. So had Hilda. Try to imagine that everything that happens to us goes on in someone else's mind. We are that mind. That means we have no soul. We are someone else's soul. I contend with it. I'm very curious about this, but we're not going to play with it here. So far, we are on familiar philosophical ground. Both Berkeley and Schelling would prick up their ears. Jump down a little bit. So what I am saying to you now will be read by Hilda after her father in Lebanon once imagined that I was telling you he was in Lebanon, imagining me telling you that he was in Lebanon. On and on. But, very bottom of the page, but they shouldn't feel so cocky because of that. They are the last people who should laugh, because laughter can easily get stuck in their throat. Who are you talking about? Hilda and her father. And why shouldn't they feel so cocky? Because it is feasible that they too are nothing but mind. How could that be? How could they be? If it was possible for Berkeley and the Romantics, it must be possible for them. Maybe the Major is also a shadow in a book about him and Hilda, which is also about us, since we are a part of their lives. I think Sophie's right. That would be even worse. That makes us only shadows of shadows. I'll jump down just a little bit farther. I'm just saying it's possible. To us, that author would be a hidden God. Although everything we are and everything we say and do proceeds from him, because we are him, we will never be able to know anything about him. We are in the innermost box. Now, there is no contention here for me around the fun, just the wonderful play that is going on in this almost, we've talked about the idea of homunculus before, this almost homunculus-like version of being as being a personality, but really your soul consisting of, well, someone else's soul in whose mind you are playing out the drama of your life. And then that in turn being someone else's, in fact, also in the mind of someone else's. So it's boxes within boxes, and they're in the innermost box. Just a very fascinating thing to think about, and I think Alberto was right to propose it. Hopefully you've already been kind of thinking about this, given all the hints and everything along the way, that this could be possible. And now that we are here at this point in the book, in talking about romanticism and romantic irony, and this is the second part of the question, what is the romantic irony here? It's talking about itself. So this is not even that groundbreaking to us by this point. We get it. They know they're a fiction, and furthermore, we know that if it's going to start talking about the writer of Albert Nag and Hilda, who is that? That's Gaarder. Gaarder is now being referred to. The work is being referred to. Sophie's world itself is being referred to. That's what makes it a romantic irony. Straight up, if you go down a little bit farther, and this is going to be an important point for us, here, this is one of the first times that now Sophie suggests something even further. She says, it's possible that author shouldn't be cocky either. Meaning Gaarder, right? What do you mean? He is sitting somewhere, hiding both Hilda and me deep inside his head. Isn't it just possible that he too is part of a higher mind? Alberto nodded. Of course it is, Sophie. That's also a possibility, and if that is the way it is, it means he has permitted us to have this philosophical conversation in order to present this possibility. He wishes to emphasize that he too is a helpless shadow, and that this book, in which Hilda and Sophie appear, is in reality a textbook on philosophy. Now that could not be a more blatant. You're now talking about what the book itself is. It couldn't be more blatantly, romantically ironic. A textbook? Because all our conversations, all our dialogues are in reality one long monologue. And note too, a textbook can refer to itself as a textbook, and that's not a romantic irony. So this is pushing something. This is not part of what needed to be, is not expected as an answer to this question, a response to this question. But I want you to think about this for a second. Is this a fiction anymore? Is it a fiction, or is it a textbook that uses a fiction for demonstrating the principles of philosophy? Or is it a fiction that it takes on an almost textbook-like approach to moving through a story by going through the events of philosophy and history? Can we even answer that question? So what Gaarder is doing actually is pushing the limits of what we even can call a book to be. We think it's so easy sometimes. We've got fiction and nonfiction. If we want to get all categorical about things, and we're the librarians, which of these would you put this in? Is it a nonfiction textbook that uses fiction, or is it a fiction work that utilizes a sort of textbook monologue in order to get a story across? That is not something I can answer for you. All right, let's plow forward. It does continue to get more interesting, doesn't it? I think it does. What does Alberto claim all philosophical systems up to Hegel have in common regarding time, and how does Hegel's philosophy differ? We're going to look on page 362 in the Hegel chapter. Go midway down. All the philosophical systems before Hegel had one thing in common, namely the attempt to set up eternal criteria for what man can know about the world. You remember how we said this was what was so obviously definite about modern philosophy, this solidifying of the idea of a philosophical system for everything. Now, this was true of Descartes, Spinoza, Hume, and Kant. Each and every one had tried to investigate the basis of human cognition, but they had all made pronouncements on the timeless factor of human knowledge of the world. Sophie rightly asks, isn't that a philosopher's job? Hegel did not believe it was possible. He believed that the basis of human cognition changed from one generation to the next. There were therefore no eternal truths, nor timeless reason. No timeless reason. The only fixed point philosophy can hold on to is history itself. The unfolding of history, as we describe in the in-depth look, the unfolding of truths and history itself as we get closer and closer to some culmination point, which, as you can probably imagine, Hegel believed was going to be around his time. As most people do, we think this is the moment, this is when all things come together, or this is the end of the world is in my generation. whatever it might be that you're thinking, whether it's the most positive sense of absolute spirit or the most condemning negative sense of Armageddon, which is sort of a misnomer, but never mind that. It tends to happen in our minds is now, especially the older you get. You look back and realize that everything seems to lead up to some sort of culmination point if you're in this sort of mode to begin with. That is philosophy, the philosophical mode. Now, what is the name of the process called that Hegel used to interpret history and philosophy up to his time? We talked about that in In-Depth Look 2. What is a real-life example of the three phases of this process? We came up with several examples of Hegel's. Not so many real-life examples you might take away today, but let's reference the book first, and then we'll get to that. Check out page 364, bottom of 364. Alberto says, yes, history is one long chain of reflections. Hegel also indicated certain rules that apply for this chain of reflections. Anyone studying history in depth will observe that a thought is usually proposed on the basis of other previously proposed thoughts. But as soon as one thought is proposed, it will be contradicted by another. A tension arises between these two opposite ways of thinking, but the tension is resolved by the proposal of a third thought, which accommodates the best of both points of view. Hegel calls this a dialectic process. And we went into, of course, lots of detail in the in-depth look, so I won't say anything more on that. But jumping down towards the bottom, you can see it even mentions that he called these three stages of knowledge: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So let's use that vocabulary for a second to come up with a real-life example. Now, of course, I really want you to come up with your own in processing, digesting this material, but I'll do one too, just in the spirit of contribution and creativity. One example I really like is why do we use traffic lights and stop signs and such to begin with? You could think almost as, think of the historical event of the creation of a vehicle, a moving vehicle, an automobile, a car. It allows you to move freely, doesn't it? You can go anywhere all of a sudden. As long as there's a road, there's a way to get there, then you can drive your car and you can now traverse the countryside, the country itself, liberty, freedom. Then, of course, when everybody starts using cars, you have a problem. First of all, the roads can end up being quite dangerous if people are going too fast to get to where they're going. They can hit people and hurt people. Then, of course, cars can crash into each other if it's not clearly if there's no clear designation of when someone should go where, when, and so forth. You get car crashes. You get this sort of antithesis or opposite. Instead of more life and freedom, you get death and destruction. So what do you need? Well, the synthesis there perhaps would be the construction of rules, driving laws. You also have speed zones, or what are they called? Speed limits. There it is. Speed limit zones and so forth, and traffic lights. All these stop signs. These are all seemingly constrictive, and yet that's part of what it is taking away from both of these is the need for safety and for being able to get where you want to go. So now you can still drive your car. You can still get there faster than if you were walking or riding your bike there. But without those rules, you would have the death and destruction part. You'd have the complete compromise of safety, and there's no freedom in death necessarily. Maybe some artists or poets would disagree with me on that, but I don't think so. So there you have freedom, and you have a more fulfilling life because you can actually live it and not be crippled or die from the process. So there's an example that I like that I think I've actually heard elsewhere before, but I like that one particularly. Next, what is the resolution to the tension between being and nothingness to Hegel, and how does this relate to his version of reasoning as a dynamic logic? Now, you're only going to be expected to understand this question and this problem in accordance with Gaarder's explanation, not mine. If you couldn't tell from the in-depth look, mine's a little bit different because I think that I'm doing a bit of a deeper read into Hegel there. But let's see again how Hegel describes it, and Hegel a la Alberto, of course. On midway down 368, it says, if I reflect on the concept of being, I will be obliged to introduce the opposite concept, that of nothing. You can't reflect on your existence without immediately realizing that you won't always exist. The tension between being and nothing becomes resolved in the concept of becoming, because if something is in the process of becoming, it both is and is not. Hegel's reason is thus dynamic logic. Since reality is characterized by opposites, a description of reality must therefore also be full of opposites. Now, again, check out In-Depth Look if you want a more perhaps rigorous or thorough view, in my opinion, of what is being proposed exactly by being and why that would be paired with nothingness, not just as a diametrically opposed, what would seem a contradiction in terms, but as possible of a synthesis. That would not be clear here on its own account. Simply saying A and not A is not actually the synthesis. That would be, to me, the antithesis. But again, let's not get into the weeds here for the moment. Let's just see what it is that Gaarder wants us to take away from this. Why dynamic logic? It's dynamic because precisely what we tend not to do is, if we propose A to be the case, it is raining right now, where I am. Then to propose not A, it is not raining at this moment where I am. Then this contradiction is only capable of being resolved through a synthesis. And so it's a dynamic logic because in most cases we would simply throw out A altogether if we were to come across A and not A. If you ever go through a formal logic study, or class or anything someday, you will recognize that that's the case, that often we posit A and then we go down the line of reasoning, and if we come across not A, well then A and not A, that must mean that A cannot be the case, so it must inherently be not A. That is a specific logical form, but what Hegel is proposing, in a way, and this is via Gaarder, is that you have A, and then you realize there is not A, and that both of these are in some way or version true. It is not raining here right now at the moment that I say it, but perhaps seconds later it actually does start, raindrops start, and in that moment it is not A. So some sort of reconciliation through time ends up being a synthesis of those two seeming opposites. And so A and not A are in a way, they're not compatible. They are still a contradiction, but we overcome the contradiction by way of synthesis. The synthesis, though, should not be equated with the contradiction. If you're not sure you get that distinction yet, it will not be imperative moving forward for you to get it, but just maybe continue to come back to this idea every now and then. It definitely will help hone your logic skills over time. And then, what did Hegel mean by absolute spirit? Our last question. And how did it relate for him to the nature of philosophy as a form of knowledge? And we talked a lot about absolute spirit already too, but let's go on and look at page 370. And we go nearly to the bottom. According to Hegel, it is not the individual that finds itself, it is the world spirit. The world spirit finds itself? Hegel said that the world spirit returns to itself in 3 stages. By that, he means that it becomes conscious of itself in 3 stages. And we're not necessarily talking about the 3 stages of the dialectic here, so don't get too confused with that. The world spirit first becomes conscious of itself in the individual, right? So, my own spirit. This is the subjective spirit, according to Hegel, and it reaches a higher consciousness in the family, civil society, and the state, right? So we have more and more individuals, and notice that what I might do or say or will or even desire changes, is in interaction with and changes according to how other people's spirits are as well. So this then moves it into objective spirit. He doesn't mean subjective and objective, by the way we often use it, like objectively the apple fell to the ground, and subjectively it actually was pulled by a, some invisible hand to the ground, whatever you like there. That's not what this means here. It's subjective in terms of subject, I, the individual, as a subject, versus objective, object, that which is more than just any one subject, is kind of what he's getting at here. But then there's a third stage, he says. The world spirit reaches the highest form of self-realization in absolute spirit. So this is neither subjective nor objective, it's absolute. And this absolute spirit is art, religion, and philosophy. And of these, philosophy is the highest form of knowledge because in philosophy, the world spirit reflects on its own impact on history. So the world spirit first meets itself in philosophy. You could say perhaps that philosophy is the mirror of the world spirit. More on the last line in a second. But can you even, this is words of Hegel's through Gaarder, through Alberto, technically also through Albert Nag, whatever. It drips of such the obvious bias of his own time, believing that he is, if not he alone, then among those who are with him in his time, Hegel is bringing about this very absoluteness of spirit. Listen to that again. It is art, religion, and philosophy, and of these, philosophy is the highest form of knowledge because in philosophy, the world spirit reflects on its own impact on history. How is that reflection going about? Well, look, Hegel's writing it out as we're reading it on the page. The world spirit is reflecting on itself. Absolute spirit is coming to culmination. So in these maybe final years, we will see in Hegel's time, right? In these final years, we will see that culmination come about, and his work is among those, if not the most important catalyst, pivotal moment for this to come about. Now, that all said, and you know, biases and stuff aside, I think it's fair to say that philosophy certainly does have a look on knowledge that is unique and different and incredibly important. We were talking last time in the in-depth video about the importance of viewing the branches in one sense as studies of the preconditions for knowledge, art, morality, and so forth. And so in this way, perhaps we are getting as meta as we can get through the process of philosophy. We just also need to be very careful about saying that any one discipline, I mean, philosophers alone are not going to know how to dissect things very well, or to explore the Mariana Trench, or operate the James Webb Telescope. It also is not always usually the philosopher that comes up with the best art. I hate to admit that many philosophers are not very great writers in terms of grammar and prose and so forth. But that, again, is not the point. The point is that philosophers are perhaps in this way critical and necessary for the sake of many of these other disciplines and such to have connections to one another. Perhaps that's our job as philosophers, to find what it is that what is the big picture to all these different disciplines. We can get into the weeds in any one of them and over specialize and then look at everything as genetic material or as simply words on a page. Those are both very prominent viewpoints in the world, and you will find major advocates for both of those. But perhaps the philosopher's role really is to look over the whole and get a big picture view and try and make the connections between these disciplines that are meaningful and hopefully progress both philosophy, but also just as importantly, those other disciplines forward as well, towards new innovation, towards novel forms. Now, I said we'd come back to that line about the mirror. Jump down a little bit on 371. Let's see. Hilda asks, do you think it has anything to do with the brass mirror? Alberto says, since you ask, yes. What do you mean? I assume the brass mirror has some special significance since it is constantly cropping up. Remember that whole thing about repetition? When it repeats, we need to pay attention to it. You must have an idea what that significance is. I haven't. I merely said that it wouldn't keep coming up unless it had a special significance for Hilda and her father. What that significance is, only Hilda knows. And we see, therefore, more than one form of compromise in being Sophie or Alberto in this book at this time. It's not simply as bad as your actions, your behaviors, your very thoughts maybe, and at least, if not entirely, then primarily, mostly the inclinations, the behaviors, the thoughts, the mind of the person writing you. But furthermore, that means you also cannot understand. It's kind of like inside jokes. You can't be part of an inside joke unless you know the full scope of the picture of where the inside joke has taken place. And only the people who are involved in that joke, at least two parties, right, are aware of what that picture is, of what that is. But he's saying there's something even more critically dire about this. He's saying it would be impossible, unless explicated by Albert himself, it would be impossible for them to come across that on their own, to figure it out by way of reason. So up to this point, there's been so much to say by Alberto and by others, and even myself, that reason is going to be a guiding principle forward. This might be the very way in which they get out of this mess, as no matter what Albert Nag says, 2 + 5 will equal 7. But now we come up to this brink of where the impossibility, we talked about the inexhaustibility was the word we used in the in-depth look, where we will be unable to capture elements of the full scope, something that is not infinite for Hilda and Albert, but is, relatively speaking, infinite in scope to Sophie and Alberto. They will not be able to comprehend things that Albert does not directly give them and inspire them with, no matter how much reason they implement. And so, again, why is Gaarder writing this book? It's not just to instruct us in philosophy, but in a way almost using philosophy as the kindle for the fire of this thought. Is this in any way related to the fact that we too have good reason to think that we will never completely, that it's in fact perhaps even by default impossible for us to know everything about our universe or who we are or where we came from? We need to keep revisiting this over and over again. We will get more opportunities, as you can imagine. All right, that's it for today. Next time we speak, we're going to be talking about two other very important thinkers. We'll be talking about Kierkegaard, and we'll be talking about Marx. And in the in-depth look, we may actually start with Marx as a continuation of Hegel. But we'll definitely need to talk very deeply about Kierkegaard too, and how Gaarder is relating him to this whole story. So, talk to you then.